Welcome to session number 11 of OAuth with Access Manager. In this session, we are going to see about the OAuth and the OpenID Connect. So, to understand that, if you go to the internet or Google it, you will get the various documents on it. A difference between the OpenID Connect and the OAuth, why the OpenID Connect is required if we have already OAuth in place. So this information you can easily get from the internet. But in short, OAuth is basically an authorization protocol. It provides a restricted access to the user. But OpenID Connects is basically built on top of OAuth, and it provides an identity layer on top of the authorization layer. So OpenID provides an identity layer on OAuth 2.0. Uh, if we talk about the OAuth, OAuth basically provides the access token, but the access token does not have any information related to the user, like who the user is, what authentication mechanism is used to authenticate the user, who is the issuer who has provided the certificate, sorry, who is the issuer who has provided the access token. Uh, no certificate, sorry, that was a wrong statement. So all this information you can basically get using the OpenID. So in case of OpenID, what happens that authorization server will provide another token which is called the ID token. Okay, so ID token, that ID token can be used by the client to verify the end user based on the authentication performed by Access Manager. This ID token is basically a JWT token. Uh, we will talk about the JWT token in the coming session, but just to understand, it's a token which has a capability of containing the information in itself. It has a it is basically a three part token, and the good thing about the ID token, it is provided in terms of JWT, and that token is not encrypted, whereas the other token which is provided by Access Manager, for example access token, is encrypted. uh, so as you remember, in our previous session, we are using the resource server, which is by default coming from the identity server is the identity provider. And if you go and look into that, you can see there is an option of whether to encrypt token or not. So if you will not change anything, and if you will use the default value as we are using, your access token is going to be encrypted, and you cannot decrypt it using any JWT token decryptor. But the ID token you can decrypt because it is not encrypted. So to know more about the OAuth and OpenID, I would suggest to go to, you can also go to the documentation, uh, and the documentation admin guide. You will, if you go and click on why OpenID Connect, you can get the information which I was talking right now, that OAuth allows user to authorize client application to access user protected resource through an access token. The access token does not contain any information about a user's identity. Hence, a client application does not know who the user is. A client application also does not know if the authorization server has issued the access token to it or any other relying party. Uh, so OpenID connects, build an OAuth and provides solution for the OAuth limitations. So this is the same thing which I was talking before. It also says the ID token also contain information about the issuing authority, the intended client application, the time of the token created, and the token expiration time. So this OpenID is just a authentication layer on top of the OAuth authorization layer. The next thing what we are going to do is we are going to explore the OpenID Connect and the ID token using Let's OAuth. So to do that, go to the browser and access the tool. Once you access the tool, you will see this dashboard. Now, before performing any operation, what we will do, we will go to the admin console, go to OAuth OpenID Connect, and go to the global setting and make sure the token type has configured for ID token. If this is not configured, you will not be able to get ID token. The next thing what you have to do, this was the global setting. The next thing what you have to do, you have to go to the client application and check your client application for the token type. So in this token type, I don't see any ID token is there. So what we need to do, we need to edit the client application and select ID token option here. When you select this ID token, go and modify client, and then you need to pass this information to the identity server. Now we have enabled the ID token option with the client application and pass this information to the IDP server. We are good to go and try to execute and see how the ID token looks. So to execute that, there are a couple of ways. The first way, you can use the authorization code flow. This is the authorization code flow. Let's go and take the code first. So go and take your client ID. Response type would be code. Response server is the default response server. Redirect URI. Scope. This is important. So when you want to get the ID token, if you just use the authorization flow, you will not get the ID token. What you need to do, you need to basically use your scope, and also you need to pass a scope called OpenID. This step is must. If you don't pass the OpenID scope, you will not get the ID token. Okay, let's give a state ID token. This is just a string. It's not supposed to be ID token. It can be just any string. ACR values, we'll leave it blank. Response mode, you can use form post. Response mode, as in the previous session you have said, response mode are the three response mode are possible: form post, query, and the fragment. When you do the form post, IDP will send the response on this particular file using a post binding, form based submit. If you use the query, you will see the query string is coming here, the URL question mark, and then the ID equal to value pairs will be there. But if you do fragment, it will come in the terms of fragment. Okay, so when we are taking the code, we need to make sure this is set to OpenID. Okay, now we'll go and submit. This will ask us for the authentication. So what we can do, we can go and I think I have created a new user. So the user is OAuthID user, and we are going to use this user now. So once you authenticate, as it is a new user, it is asking to provide the consent. Let's go and accept it, and we are getting a code here, if you see the scope return is not returning OpenID. So OpenID is just for when you pass the OpenID, it's just for the IDP to understand that you are looking for ID token. It will not be provided in the response. So let's take this code and go to the second option, get access token using code, and fill the information, client ID, client secret, grant type will be authorization code, same as the authorization code flow, identity server, resource server is the identity provider, provide your redirect URI, and then paste the authorization code and send this information. Once you send this information, you can see you are getting an access token, you are getting a reference token, and you are getting a ID token. Okay, so if you see access token is, so what we are going to do, we'll just copy all this and see with a tool called JWT and see what behavior, what kind of token they are. So let's do raw data, copy this, and gonna paste it here. So I got an access token, I got the expiration of the token, I got a reference token, and I got the ID token. Okay, so let's go and take this particular token, which is the access token. Copy this token, and what you need to do, you need to use this is online available tool, jwt.io. So here basically, if you go down here, there is a section where you can paste your JWT token. So when you paste the JWT token, you basically see that there are three different fields here. So a JWT token is a three dotted, it contains three different fields separated by a dot, and the different fields are, the first one is header, the second is the payload, and third is the signature. Okay, but when you are using the access token, you can see the payload is actually encrypted, you cannot see it. So the access token, if the client is taking that access token, it cannot find out what is actually the content of that access token. The reason is, when we are using the default resource server, you can see it says that access token encryption is encrypt using access manager key. So access manager has some kind of keys which it uses to the encrypt. So when access manager is encrypting this token, only access manager is supposed to decrypt this token, and only it can decrypt the token. So if you want to get any information related to token, about the token content and some information about the user, you need to basically use the user info endpoint or token info endpoint or the introspection endpoint to know about it, that what is the content of that token. But but if you take the ID token here, let's go and select this ID token, and if I paste this, you can see the information here. Okay, so if you see the header information uh, is present, but the payload, the main thing is the payload, which is not encrypted. So if you look at the payload, you can basically see it has the information about the issuer, who has issued that. So this is the issuer URL of NAM server sub. This basically says that what is the GUID of this user. So this basically provides you the information of the user. Okay. If you look at this audience, it says that who was the audience. So this is the client IP, client ID, when it is going to expire. So if you just hover it on, you will come to know what does it say. So when it is going to expire, and IAT when the token is generated. So if you see the token is generated at 10:23, it is going to expire at 11:23 after 1 hour. It also provides you the ACRUs, which is the name password URI. So without even sending the user info or token info request, you can basically get the user info, the user authentication info using the OpenID Connect, and that information comes into the token called ID token. You can see ID underscore token. The one thing you need to make sure when you are using the authorization code flow, the scope information when you send, you need to give the OpenID. So this is one of the way to get the OpenID. There is another way to get the OpenID, and that is called HybridFlow. So HybridFlow is basically a unique flow, and this flow basically combines the multiple token together. So using HybridFlow, you can basically get the authorization code, token, and the ID token, or any combination of these three uh, in the single request. So HybridFlow, uh, things are exactly same as how the authorization code is there, but one little difference which we'll talk about it. To use the HybridFlow, you need not to do any configuration change. If you have the configuration for the authorization code flow and the ID token code, ID token flow, you can basically use the HybridFlow. So let's go and check the how HybridFlow can be used to get a combination of the code, token, and ID token. To do that, go ahead and start your client. So you can see there is a link here, HybridFlow. Click on this link, and this will give you a form which can be used for the HybridFlow. Okay, client ID, give the client ID. Response type, this is important. So the response type here says code, ID token, and token. So it is going to give you authorization code, ID token, as well as the token. There are the various combination you can use. To know that what are the various combination can be used, you can follow the developer documentation, and in the developer documentation you can see response type, and it says to set it to code to indicate authorization code flow. OpenID Connect HybridFlow is supported. The supported response types are, you can use none, you can use code, you can use the code ID token, code or token, or a combination of all three. So for this demo, I'm going to use the combination of all the three: code ID and code ID token and token. Resource server is my default server. Redirect URI. Scope. So if you see, it says that scope use plus for many OpenID is must. So we are going to provide the scope, same email plus OpenID, and provide a state, let's say hybrid flow. As I said that it is almost same as the authorization code flow, but with a difference. This is called the nonce. Okay, so for the nonce, what is basically the nonce? To know that, you can go to the developer documentation and read about it. Nonce is basically a string value used to associate a client session with the ID token and to mitigate the replay attack. So this is required when you are using the ID token with the code or with the token. This is required when you have specified the response type as ID token, or you have sent the request with the token and the ID token. So if your response type includes ID underscore token, you need to use the nonce value. Okay, nonce, we can give any string, nonce for hybrid flow. Response mode, let's take the form post. I like this response mode most, and I believe this is the most secure. Go and press the button send. When you press the button send, you will go for the authentication. So we are going to use the same user which I just used for the ID token, which is OAuthID user password. Now, as we have just used this user, it is not going to ask for the consent because we have already provided the consent for the user, and that you basically see in the here. You can see here we have already email and the profile is already provided. So go here and authenticate, and you are getting a code, you are getting an access token, as well as you are getting an ID token. Okay, the state is coming back. It says the for access token, it says that how much time it's going to take to expire. So you have the code, this code you can use. You have an access token already, and you have also a ID token. Okay, so this is a very unique combination. So let's go and check this ID token. What is the value for it? So as in the OpenID section, we talked that ID token is not encrypted by the access manager. You can go to the JWT.io and copy it here, and you can see, right? If I will use a different ACR values, I can use the different authentication. We already discussed that if you will not use any ACR values, then the default contract is executed. But if you pass the ACR underscore values, you can execute the contract you want. So this was all about the OpenID Connect, how it can be used for with the Access Manager, and how it enhances the feature of the authorization by providing an identity layer. We also talked about Access Manager provides an unencrypted ID token, which is the JWT token, and you can check the token using JWT.io. We explore the OpenID token, and also we explore the HybridFlow to get the code token and the ID token at the same time. So this is it with this session. In next session, we may talk about the client application management. Thank you.